Ask Dan Schneider. Angela asks me, Dan, now that Donald Hall is dead, can you really give your opinion about him as a person and a poet? Well, thanks for the question. I don't think I've ever held back on what I thought of Donald Hall. He was a bad poet. There's no doubt about it. Randall Jarrell, the poet and critic from the mid 20th century, famously dismissed a book of poetry from Hall in the 1950s with a one-word review. The question, why? Hall was someone who, in a 60-plus year academic career, wrote maybe 5 or 6 good, solid poems. Probably the best poem he ever wrote was the poem about an aeroplane rusting in New Guinea highlands after being shot down in World War II. That being said, on a personal level, I never met Donald Hall, never had a conversation with him, unlike, say, Robert Bly. But Donald Hall to me was a consummate phony. I saw him twice read. The first time was at the West Side Y, the 92nd Street Y in New York, back in the late 80s, probably 86, 87, 88, maybe 89. Then a few years later, in the mid 90s, I saw him read in Minneapolis at a church. And this was just after his wife, Jane Kenyon, had died. And he had written a bad book of poems about her. And I noticed the first time that he was a fairly manipulative reader. He tried for melodramatics. But the second time, after his wife died, the manipulation of emotion and him crying right on cue just seemed very phony. The poems were terrible. Even if he had read them sincerely, which I doubt he did, they would have been bad. But the desire to manipulate people is not something that I think is a good thing. Yes, art directs people towards emotional and intellectual, especially, outlets, but to blatantly manipulate like that is not a good thing. And got even his book of essays, like about products of Portugal, and he wasn't even a good essay writer. Yeah, was he better than someone like a David Foster Wallace or Dave Eggers? Yeah, sure, but then, chlamydia is better than having AIDS, I guess. On the other hand, he was a terrible poet at his worst. Was he worse than a Maya Angelou or many of the tens of thousands of doggerlists who have come along? Probably not, but there's no reason, absolutely no reason that Donald Hall should be remembered for anything else than being a poetic fraud. So that's my thoughts about him. Again, they're no different than what I had when he was living. So thank you for the question.